Apple's power did not come only from adding more. Some of its most valuable moves came from refusing to open everything up, even when the rest of the market thought openness was the absolute future of technology. If you ask the average consumer why Apple is a $3 trillion company, they will likely point to the physical objects in their hands. They will talk about the smooth glass of the iPhone, the unibody aluminum of the MacBook, or the seamless integration of the AirPods. The surface story of Apple is a story of Apple is a story of industrial design. It is the narrative of Steve Jobs, the perfectionist, and Jony Ive, the artist, creating devices that felt less like consumer electronics and more like luxury artifact. In this widely accepted version of history, Apple wins simply because it builds better, more beautiful hardware. But this view is deeply incomplete. Many companies have built beautiful hardware. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Sony was producing hardware that was widely considered the pinnacle of consumer electronics. A decade later, HTC was machining beautiful aluminum and smartphones. Today, Samsung produces incredibly sophisticated hardware with folding glass and edge-to-edge displays. Yet none of these companies capture the sheer volume of global profit that Apple commands. Beautiful hardware alone does not create a $3 trillion valuation. It does not create the kind of financial gravity that pulls in the entire global supply chain. To understand why Apple truly won, we have to look past the physical products. We have to look at a strategic paradox that defies the conventional wisdom of the modern tech industry. For the last 40 years, the dominant doctrine in Silicon Valley has been that open systems always defeat closed systems. This was the grave lesson of the 1980s and 1990s. Apple created the Macintosh, a beautiful, tightly integrated closed system. Microsoft created Windows, an open, heavily licensed operating system that could run on entirely commoditized hardware built by Dell, HP, Compaq, and IBM. The market delivered a swift and brutal verdict. Microsoft conquered the world and Apple was nearly driven into bankruptcy. The tech industry concluded that open platforms which allow for maximum distribution, maximum developer freedom, and maximum hardware variety will always overwhelm a closed, proprietary system. So, when Apple launched the iPhone in 2007 and subsequently launched the App Store in 2008 with strict, unyielding rules, the smartest minds in technology thought Apple was committing corporate suicide all over again. Google introduced Android as an open-source licensable operating system, directly mirroring the Microsoft playbook from the 1990s. The consensus was clear: Android would flood the market, hardware would commoditize, and Apple would be pushed into an irrelevant niche corner of the market, entirely suffocated by its own refusal to open up. But history did not repeat itself. Instead, Apple's closed system became the most lucrative business empire in human history. Why did the rules suddenly change? They didn't. What the industry failed to understand was that the landscape of technology had shifted from enterprise utilities to personal ecosystems, and in a personal ecosystem, maximum freedom does not create maximum value. Apple realized something fundamental that its competitors missed. A platform without constraints is a platform without a moat. When you open an ecosystem entirely, the value naturally migrates away from the creator of the hardware and diffuses into the software layer. If any phone can run any software, the phone becomes a commodity. The hardware becomes a dumb pipe. To prevent the iPhone from becoming a dumb pipe, Apple had to build a hidden system beneath the glass and the aluminum. They had to construct an invisible architecture of control. They did this not by adding features, but by strategically taking them away. They weaponized constraints. Consider the early days of the smartphone wars. The industry standard was to give network carriers the freedom to preload software, modify the interface, and control the user experience. Apple refused. The constraint was absolute. AT&T could carry the iPhone, but they could not alter a single pixel on the screen. By removing the carrier's freedom, Apple guaranteed a baseline of quality for the user, but more importantly, they ensured that the relationship remained between Apple and the consumer, not the carrier and the consumer. Then, this could have handled developers. Android allowed users to sideload applications from anywhere on the internet. Apple forced every single developer on Earth to pass through a single, heavily guarded choke point, the iOS App Store. Developers complained bitterly. Tech pundits called it draconian. But this severe constraint created a marketplace devoid of friction. Because users could not accidentally download malware and because the payment system was unified and secured by Apple, user trust skyrocketed. In the open Android ecosystem, users had infinite choice but were hesitant to spend money. In the constrained Apple ecosystem, users had fewer choices, but they opened their wallets with zero hesitation. The constraint actually created the economic velocity. Apple discovered that if you curate the environment ruthlessly, you can charge a premium for access to that environment. This economic velocity funded the next phase of the strategy, the construction of the ecosystem wall. Most consumer technology companies view their products as standalone utilities. A laptop is just a laptop. A pair of headphones is just an accessory. Apple, however, began viewing its hardware as interconnected nodes within a closed network. To make this network infinitely valuable, Apple had to ensure that the friction of leaving the ecosystem was significantly higher than the financial cost of staying inside it. They achieved this through deliberate interoperability constraints. Consider the seamless integration of AirDrop, the universal clipboard that lets you copy text on an iPhone and paste it on a Mac, or the way AirPods instantly switch audio sources. Consumers perceive these features as technological magic. In reality, they are the byproduct of severe structural discipline. These features work so flawlessly precisely because Apple refuses to support the fragmented open protocols of the broader market. They force a unified standard across their own hardware. The constraint is the absolute prerequisite for the magic. When this logic is applied to communication, the constraint becomes a cultural weapon. The blue bubble of iMessage is a prime example. Technically, iMessage is simply a proprietary messaging protocol, but strategically, it is an engineered moat. iMessage works beautifully on Apple devices, but Apple aggressively degraded the experience when communicating with Android devices, stripping away high-quality media sharing and RAID receipts. This was not a technical limitation. It was a highly calculated choice. By refusing to port iMessage to Android, Apple created a social constraint. In key demographics, particularly among younger consumers in the United States, the green text bubble became a digital symbol of exclusion. Apple turned a basic communication utility into a mechanism for peer pressure, effectively locking an entire generation into purchasing iPhones not for the hardware, but for the social access the hardware granted. But the architecture of Apple's control goes much deeper than software features. To understand the true power of their constraints, we have to look at the invisible machine operated by the company's most critical strategic figure, Tim Cook. While Steve Jobs was the visionary who created the object of desire, Tim Cook was the supply chain architect who turned that desire into an inescapable global system. Before becoming CEO, Cook realized that physical manufacturing could also be weaponized as a constraint against the market. When Apple decided to build laptops and phones out of unibody aluminum, the industry standard was to contract factories using whatever machinery was readily available. Cook's approach was entirely different. He invested billions of dollars to buy up the global supply of advanced CNC milling machines, the equipment necessary to carve these aluminum bodies. By doing so, Apple didn't just secure its own production lines, it effectively starved its competitors of the equipment they needed to match Apple's build quality. The constraint wasn't just applied to Apple's own ecosystem. It was forcefully applied to the physical capabilities of rival companies. Apple owned the means of perfection, locking the rest of the industry out. This philosophy of absolute control eventually reached its ultimate frontier, the silicon itself. For decades, the personal computer industry operated on a modular, open-market supply chain. You bought processors from Intel, graphics cards from NVIDIA, and operating systems from Microsoft. It was a flexible marketplace. For a long time, Apple played by these rules, relying heavily on Intel processors for its Mac lineup. But Apple recognized that relying on a third-party vendor for its core engine was a dangerous vulnerability. If Intel's innovation slowed down, which it did, Apple's hardware would suffer, and there was nothing Apple could do about it. The dependency was limiting their future. The decision to transition to Apple Silicon, the in-house M-series chips, was a colossal operational risk. It required rewriting entire operating systems and forcing millions of developers to adapt their software architectures. But the constraint of building everything internally yielded an insurmountable advantage. Because Apple designs the silicon, the hardware, and the software in total isolation, they do not have to build generic, compromised chips designed to work for dozens of different PC manufacturers. They build highly specialized silicon optimized exclusively for macOS and iOS. This is the hidden reason an M-series MacBook operates with such devastating efficiency compared to its modular competitors. The battery life, the lack of fan noise, and the thermal performance are not simply the result of better engineering. They are the direct result of an inherently superior structural model. The closed, constrained system allowed for a level of vertical integration so tight that the rest of the tech industry, reliant on a fragmented and open supply chain, physically could not match it. This philosophy of absolute control eventually expanded beyond hardware and supply chains. In recent years, Apple applied this exact same weaponization of constraints to the most lucrative resource in the modern digital economy: user data. For over a decade, the digital advertising industry, led by giants like Meta and Google, relied on the frictionless, open flow of data across different applications. It was a multi-billion-dollar invisible machine running in the background of the internet. Apple looked at this open data economy and recognized an opportunity to build another massive wall. They introduced App Tracking Transparency, or ATT. Publicly, this feature was heavily marketed as a moral crusade for user privacy. Apple positioned itself as the sole defender of the consumer in a predatory digital world. And while the feature did definitively increase user privacy, the strategic reality underneath was far more aggressive. That was a devastating constraint imposed unilaterally on rival tech monopolies. By forcing developers to explicitly ask for permission to track users across other apps, knowing full well that the vast majority of consumers would tap Ask App Not to Track, Apple effectively blinded the global advertising ecosystem. They cut off the primary data supply line that their competitors relied upon. The consequences were instantaneous and brutal. Meta lost tens of billions of dollars in market value almost overnight as their ad targeting algorithms degraded. Meanwhile, safely behind the walls of the ecosystem, Apple's own proprietary search advertising business quietly surged. The constraint wasn't merely protective, it was highly offensive. Because Apple owned the device, they owned the rules of the environment. They possessed the ultimate power to dictate what was allowed to flow through the system and what was permanently blocked at the gate. This brings us to the underlying reality of why Apple is both unprecedentedly dominant and at the exact same time, increasingly fragile. The ecosystem is an absolute fortress. Consumers are locked in by the social gravity of iMessage, the deep integration of iCloud, and the frictionless pairing of the Apple Watch. Developers are locked in by the sheer, undeniable purchasing power of the iOS user base. The constraints are so elegantly embedded into daily life that leaving the Apple ecosystem no longer feels like changing a phone. It feels like a severe downgrade in your digital quality of life. But this absolute architectural control is precisely what now makes the company vulnerable. The hidden system has become so powerful that it has attracted the attention of governments, regulators around the world, from the European Union forcing the adoption of USB-C and alternative app stores to the US Department of Justice filing major antitrust lawsuits, are actively attempting to dismantle these very constraints. The moat Apple built is so deep and so effective that it has ceased to be a business strategy and has escalated into a global geopolitical issue. What is the ultimate takeaway from the rise of this $3 trillion empire? The modern business world is obsessed with scale, with open platforms, with removing all friction, and with being everywhere all at once. The default assumption for a generation of entrepreneurs and executives has been that maximum freedom and maximum optionality will naturally generate maximum value. Apple's history proves the exact opposite. Absolute freedom in a marketplace often leads to rapid commoditization. When your product integrates seamlessly with everything, it differentiates itself from nothing. When you allow every third party to play by their own rules on your platform, you completely surrender the end-user experience. The real strategic lesson of Apple is that the right constraint, applied with ruthless discipline, is the foundation of an impenetrable moat. Refusing to license their software forced them to build a tighter, more intuitive ecosystem. Refusing carrier interference built unprecedented user trust. Refusing standard open market supply chains secured their manufacturing dominance, and refusing standard silicon unleashed a generation of unmatched hardware performance. Value is not created merely by what you choose to build. In the highest tiers of business, enduring value is protected, sustained, and compounded by what you deliberately choose to restrict. If you found this breakdown of Apple's hidden architecture valuable, subscribe to the channel. We dissect the invisible frameworks and strategies of the world's most powerful companies every week. Leave a comment below on which company's operating model you want us to analyze next.